What did rich Grug have that poor Grug did not? And no, the answer is not a slightly bigger rock. The answer is so specific, so petty, and so deeply human that you are going to feel personally attacked by people who lived 40,000 years ago. Let us set the scene first. Because before we talk about rich Grug, we need to talk about regular Grug. Regular Grug woke up every single morning with one job: do not die today. That was it. That was the whole to-do list. Find food, avoid becoming food, maybe sleep somewhere that does not already have something sleeping in it. Grug did not have a mortgage. Grug did not have a commute. What Grug had was a 40% chance of not making it to age 30, which sounds terrible until you factor in that Grug also had no spreadsheets. So it balances out, sort of. For most of human prehistory, life was pretty equal in the suffering department. Everybody was cold. Everybody was hungry sometimes. Everybody had the same basic toolkit of sharp rocks, pointy sticks, and the kind of optimism that comes from having no idea how bad your teeth look. There were no landlords, no bosses, no one person who had dramatically more stuff than everyone else. Archaeologists call this a relatively egalitarian society, which is a fancy way of saying that nobody was eating better mammoth than anybody else. And then something changed. And that something is exactly what we are here to talk about. But first, let us talk about what wealth even means when you do not have a bank account or a wallet or, frankly, pockets. Because this is where it gets interesting. Grug could not store gold coins. Grug did not have a savings account. What Grug could do was collect things that were hard to get, hard to make, or hard to find. And the very first version of wealth on this planet was not money. It was stuff. Specifically, it was shells. Yes, shells. Little, round, shiny. Hard to find if you do not live near the coast. Easy to poke a hole in and string together shells. Archaeologists have found shell beads that are over 100,000 years old, found inland far from any ocean, which means somebody carried them a very long distance or traded to get them. That is not food. That is not a weapon. That is a thing you own purely because it looks nice and other people do not have it. That is the oldest piece of jewelry we have ever found, and it is also, technically, the oldest flex in human history. Here is the crazy part. We can actually trace these shells back to specific coastlines. Scientists have matched the species of shell to specific beaches. So we know that some ancient human in the middle of a continent was wearing ocean shells like they were designer accessories, and they had never seen the ocean in their life. They got those shells through trade, which means they had something worth trading, which means they had surplus, which means they were, by the standards of their time, doing pretty well. Rich Grug did not just have shells, though. Rich Grug had more of everything. More furs, which meant more warmth, which meant not dying in winter, which is an incredible luxury when you think about it. More food stored up, which meant more time to sit around not hunting. And extra tools, the good ones. Not the chipped and barely works ones that regular Grug was using, but the actually sharp ones that someone skilled had made with real care and real time. And here is where it gets a little uncomfortable. Because once you have enough extra stuff, you stop doing the hard work yourself, and somebody else starts doing it for you. We see this clearly in the archaeological record starting around 20 to 30,000 years ago. Evidence of social hierarchy, meaning some people in the group had dramatically more than others, begins showing up in burials. Because here is the thing about burials. Dead people cannot hide their stuff anymore, and archaeologists have absolutely exploited this. A burial site in Russia called Sungir, dating back about 34,000 years, contains 2 children buried with about 10,000 ivory beads each. 10,000. Archaeologists estimated that just making those beads would have taken thousands of hours of skilled labor. These children never had the chance to earn that. They were born into it, which means that 34,000 years ago, before farming, before cities, before writing, before everything we consider civilization, there were already families who were just born with more stuff than everyone else. That is inheritance. That is generational wealth. That is 40,000 years old, and suddenly you feel less unique for complaining about it. And it gets worse, or better, depending on how much you love ancient drama. Once someone in the group had more stuff and could get other people to do the dangerous work, a very interesting thing started happening. The person with the most stuff stopped being the best hunter. They stopped being the strongest or the fastest. They started being the person who controlled the stuff. And controlling the stuff, it turns out, is an extremely effective survival strategy that requires much less running and considerably fewer near-death experiences with large animals. Archaeologists can sometimes tell who in a prehistoric group was doing heavy physical labor and who was not. How? Bones. Bones are incredible tattletales. Heavy labor leaves marks on bones. Repetitive stress, joint wear, muscle attachment points that are more pronounced because the muscles using them were enormous. The bones of regular Grug are a memoir. Every hard winter, every heavy load carried, every time Grug had to sprint away from something with too many teeth, all of that is written in the skeleton. Rich Grug's bones, by contrast, tell a very different story. Less wear, less stress, better nutrition markers in the teeth and bone density. Rich ancient humans were literally, physically different in their skeletons because they were not doing the same work. You can read the class system in prehistoric bones, and it is startlingly easy to spot. Now, at this point you might be thinking, okay, but surely everybody respected the best hunter, right? Surely the strongest, most capable person was the one who ended up on top. And the answer is, sometimes, but not always, and as societies got more complex, increasingly not at all. We see evidence that some of the earliest high-status individuals were not the best at anything physically. They were the best at something else. Ritual, ceremony, story, knowing where the animals went in winter. The person who could predict weather patterns, interpret signs, remember which plants were safe to eat, or convince the group that the spirits were happy with them. That person had an enormous amount of social power that had nothing to do with physical strength, and they collected stuff accordingly. Some of these high-status individuals appear to have been what we might call shamans or ritual specialists. We find them buried differently, buried with more care, more objects, in more elaborate ways. There is a burial in what is now the Czech Republic of a person buried with an extraordinary collection of objects including ivory figurines, a decorated skull, and jewelry made from materials sourced from hundreds of miles away. This person was not just wealthy by the standards of their group, they were connected. They had relationships, trading networks, influence that stretched across enormous distances. They were ancient influencers, and they had the sponsored content to prove it, except the sponsored content was a mammoth tooth necklace instead of a discount code. But here is the really wild part. All of this happened before farming, before cities, before anything we normally point to as the beginning of inequality. The old story used to be that humans were basically equal until agriculture came along. People settled down, started owning land, and then suddenly some people owned more land than others and everything went sideways. And agriculture did make inequality much worse and much more formalized. But the seeds of it, the actual desire to have more stuff and signal that you have it, that appears to be extremely ancient, possibly as old as modern humans themselves. When farming did arrive, though, things escalated dramatically. With farming came stored grain. With stored grain came the ability to have genuinely enormous amounts of food that regular regular agricultural peasant could not access. Grain could be controlled. Grain could be taxed. Grain could be used to feed armies that enforced the grain tax. Suddenly, the gap between the most and least wealthy people in a community was not a few extra shells. It was the difference between eating and not eating, between building the monument and having one built for you. The ancient Egyptians are an obvious example, and yes, we are going back far enough that this counts, but even before Egypt, we see it in Mesopotamia, in the ancient settlements of the Fertile Crescent. Storage buildings guarded by specific people, distribution of food controlled by whoever controlled the storage. The invention of writing, which we act like is this beautiful cultural achievement, was largely invented to track who owned what grain and who owed what to whom. The first writing in human history is basically a receipt. Grug invented literacy for accounting purposes, and honestly that checks out. And what did the wealthy ancient people do with all their extra grain, extra fur, extra shells, extra everything? They made sure you knew about it. Monumental tombs, elaborate grave goods, jewelry buried with the dead that would never be worn again, just because burying it with someone made a point about how much of it there was. The waste was the message. I have so much of this that I can afford to put it in the ground forever. Rich Grug did not just have stuff. Rich Grug made sure everyone knew he had more than he needed. And regular Grug, watching all of this, went back to chasing the mammoth. Next time you are annoyed about economic inequality, just remember that somewhere out there are 34,000-year-old bones that have already been through this whole conversation. The complaint is older than agriculture, older than cities, older than writing. The oldest human art we have might be abstract, but the second oldest human activity might just be looking at what someone else has and thinking, hey, that does not seem fair. That is the real answer to what rich Grug had that poor Grug did not. Not just more stuff. The ability to have other people get the stuff. The shell necklaces, the fancy burial, the bones that never carried a heavy load. The exact same system, just made of mammoth ivory instead of stock portfolios. Grug did not invent inequality. But Grug was there right at the beginning, watching someone else get the good seat by the fire and wondering how that happened. Some things really do not change. If you want to know what else ancient humans got up to that somehow still explains modern life perfectly, there is a lot more where this came from. Stick around. Grug has got time.